Hello everyone, welcome to the Sydney Power BI user group for February. Tonight we've decided that I'm going to present to you introduction to Power BI. So what is Power BI and why should I care? Now, Power BI is a new product, although it's been around for five and a half years now, but it's actually relatively new to many people, and there are people that are discovering Power BI all the time. So for those of you, if you have been involved with the user group here in Sydney or any other user group, no doubt you've built some knowledge about Power BI over the years, but we thought it was important just to step back and to share a beginner's overview so that people who are just starting out can understand what Power BI is all about. And so it's pretty important for me to point out before we start that if you are using Power BI on a regular basis, then there's not going to be anything new within the content that I showed you today. So please keep that in mind. I will be taking questions, and if you have any questions, then feel free to stay around and participate. But I just want to make sure that people know what it is that we'll be covering for today. So look, many of you that have joined the user group before would know me, but I just do a brief introduction in case there are people who have joined who are coming here for this beginner's introductory guide. So my background, I've worked my life at Coca-Cola, so I do have a sales and customer service background. I run the user group with Iman and also a consulting business in Sydney. I've written a few books. In fact, it's actually one book which I have evolved, and in actual fact, this is the first time I've ever showed this, the black copy of my book. So this book is the third edition of Supercharge Power BI, and I literally finished writing that, and it's off at the printers at the moment, and that will be available in the next few weeks. Now I've got a blog, and I do a lot of community work as well, including stuff like this. So the objective of this session, as I said with the intro, is to give an overview of what Power BI is all about. I don't have time to teach, this is not a training course, so I mean there's a lot to learn within the ecosystem, but what I'm trying to do with this session is create a breadth of understanding of what's possible with the tool, and hopefully to create some interest and maybe some information that might make you, then follow up and perhaps try and determine how you can use these tools within your own business. So if you're not aware of the products, then obviously it's difficult to know that you can leverage them. So just keep that in mind as we go through. I will move reasonably quickly, but also try and give something meaningful so that you can understand what is possible. Now, I'd like to start off with an overview of the Power BI ecosystem. Now, Power BI is a big ecosystem of lots of different products. So it's a brand name, but it's actually lots of different things. And so I just want to cover what Power BI includes. So first of all, there's a product called Power BI Desktop. So this is a PC-based piece of software. It's free. You can download it from the internet, from the Microsoft website. And in a similar way to Excel, you can load some data into this tool, you can build reports, you can save your files, you can email them to your friends, they can download the software for free as well, and you could live your life using Power BI Desktop if you wanted to. But that's not really how Power BI is designed to work. Power BI Desktop is an authoring tool. It's a tool to build a reporting capability, and it's really designed for you then to publish that report into the cloud, the Power BI service or powerbi.com, and once the data is loaded, the data and the reports are loaded into the cloud, then it's very easy to access those reports and data using the various mobile apps for Android and for iOS. There's also, can be consumed using a laptop PC, indeed a Mac. So because it's browser based, and it's therefore not specific to the operating system. So you can consume the final reports in a Mac. You cannot author a report using desktop with a Mac. So just keep that in mind. Now, everything on the screen you can have for free. This is all free as long as you're doing it for personal use, or more correctly, for a single person use within an organization. So if you work at a company, you could use all of these tools and you can consume all of these reports yourself. You only have to pay for Power BI when you want to share your work with somebody else. As soon as you share Microsoft comes to a conclusion that you're now getting some value because you're sharing it with somebody else in the organization, and then you have to pay. And at an entry level, it's, depending on where you're from, in Australia, it's about $13 Australian dollars per user per month, whatever that is, $150 a year, something like that, or it's 10 US dollars thereabouts, depending on where you are. And then everyone that participates in the sharing needs a license. So basically the minimum cost would be orders of magnitude sort of 300 Australian dollars if there are 2 people involved. Now, in addition to this framework that I've covered initially, there's also this thing called template apps. And so this is where companies, independent software vendors, so companies like Iman's company, might produce a template app which gives you a standardized way of consuming online data, or maybe it's some sort of standard back-end system. And basically what's happening is we're getting a third-party vendor to build the reporting capability so that you don't have to do it yourself using Power BI Desktop. And so a template app is a way that an independent vendor can develop a report for you without you having to have all the overhead of doing that work yourself. So that's template apps. There's another part of Power BI, which is the Power BI Gateway. And so what will happen typically is that once you load your report from your desktop into powerbi.com, there'll come some point in time where you'll need to refresh that data. And so a Power BI Gateway is effectively a secure connection, a VPN, if you like, a secure connection between powerbi.com and your database. And it will allow your online reports to be refreshed on a schedule. It does a few other things as well, but basically it's a secure way of transferring data between powerbi.com and your organizational databases. There's a couple of other areas that are also part of the Power BI ecosystem. So we have these 2 products called Powerpivot and Power Query for Excel. Now, both of these products have been around actually much longer than Power BI. And these 2 products, Powerpivot and Power Query, are actually the core technologies that live within inside Power BI Desktop, in addition to the visualization capability, which we'll have a look at shortly. And so this is one of the truly great things about Power BI, is that if you learn how to use Power BI, those skills are transferable to Powerpivot and Power Query for Excel. And indeed, it's transferable through to analysis services. So great way to leverage your skills across different platforms. And indeed, the product that makes up the entire suite of Power BI is forever growing. And so here are 3 examples. So Power BI Report Server is effectively an on-premise version of powerbi.com. So some companies, for various reasons, don't want to or are not legally allowed to use the cloud. And Report Server gives you the ability of having the same reporting capability, but in-house, inside your firewall. Power BI Premium is an alternate licensing method. So if you buy Premium, you're buying a capacity-based license. And you would tend to use that if you had a large number of users and those users weren't all using the software at the same time. You could buy a capacity-based license. And so that's called Power BI Premium. And then lastly, Report Builder is the equivalent of paginated reports. And so if you need to print maybe customer listings or printouts where there are multiple pages, then you would use Report Builder for that. So Power BI is really designed for on-screen live interaction. Report Builder sits on top of Power BI and allows you to print reports that might be printed out in a PDF, for example. So all of this is the Power BI ecosystem. And as I hope you can imagine, there's a lot to it, and I won't be covering all of this in detail today, but I definitely want to just talk about this process of loading, developing, publishing and consuming the reports to give you a sense of what that might look like and how that might apply in your organization. Now, there are a few things that are worth pointing out before I get into any more detail. So first of all, Power BI is not Excel. Now, it certainly was built with the Excel user in mind, and it was built initially on top of Excel, but it's not Excel. And in addition, it's not a transactional or a relational database either. Power BI is actually a reporting database built on a brand new technology. A reporting database has a different set of requirements to a relational database and a transactional database. Indeed, different set of requirements to Excel, which is a spreadsheet. But the new database was built considering the needs and knowledge of an Excel user. So if you can use Excel, then you can certainly learn how to use Power BI. But it's a different technology, and you shouldn't assume that you can just pick it up without doing any learning. Power BI is also not a silver bullet to your reporting problems. So if you've had reporting issues for a long period of time, you're not going to install the disk and hit load and then your problems will go away. It's a tool to help you with those problems, but it's not going to solve the problems on its own. You still need to have good data management. You need to have good processes in place to make all this work. But Power BI is a significant step forward for citizen developers and also enterprise reporting and analytics. So by citizen developers, what I mean is, well, people who are Excel users in the business who use Excel to solve reporting problems. So that's the citizen developer. And then it's also a product which is targeted at enterprise analytics. So perhaps companies that have used Tableau in the past or Sql Server Analysis Services, multidimensional, just to name a few. Power BI is not something that you can pick up without any effort. So as I said, you're not going to install it and just open it up and just know how to use it, even if you're a competent Excel user. That's not to say that you can't learn how to use it. I strongly believe that anyone that can use Excel at a level of capability can also learn how to use Power BI at an equivalent level of capability. But most people need a little bit of help to get started because it's sufficiently different that that's really been my experience. Okay, so just to set the framework for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to talk about how I like to categorize self-service BI and specifically using Power BI as a tool. And there are 4 logical stages where data moves from its source through to the final report and sharing that you actually end up with. And the first stage is called data acquisition. And this is the process of taking the data wherever it lives. It might be a CSV file, it might be a SQL Server database, it could be an Excel file, almost literally anywhere, any electronic form, and loading that into the Power BI database. And this is actually a really important point because Power BI is a database, it's not a spreadsheet. And the tool that we use for that, or the technology that we use for that, is called Power Query. And as I mentioned before, Power Query is available inside Excel, as long as you have a modern version of Excel, 2013 or above. And it also is bundled as part of Power BI. And I'm going to show you Power Query as it sits and lives inside Power BI in this session. So that process, that first stage, is called data acquisition. But once the data is loaded in the database, it's not ready for analysis and reporting. There's more work to be done. And so the second phase is what we call data modeling. So this is taking the data that you've loaded and structuring it and preparing it in such a way that you can extract the insights that you need. And suffice to say that you can't get all of the insights out of your data without doing some work. And that work is called data modeling, and it includes various things. And I'll cover what I consider to be included in data modeling in a slide when we get to that part of the stage later on. So it's only after you've loaded the data and prepared the data, then you start to do your visualization. And the tool that we used, or the technology, if you like, it's typically pivot tables or pivot charts if you're using Excel. And it's using the new visualization layer that is a core component of Power BI if you're using Power BI Desktop. I didn't mention before, under modeling, the technology for data modeling is called Powerpivot when it's used in Excel, and it's called Analysis Services Tabular when it's used inside Power BI. And these two technologies are the same thing, they just have a different name as they're deployed in these two different places. And so once you've done all this work, then you can start to build the visualizations using either of those two technologies. And then it's only then that you go about sharing these reports with other people. And I'll show you how the sharing works towards the end of this presentation. So that's the 4 stages of self-service BI, and I'm going to use that for the rest of my presentation just to show you where we're at. Now, before we do that, I just want to explain the Adventureworks database that I am using here. So Adventureworks is a retail chain of bicycle stores. And if you were to walk into one of those bicycle stores, you could go up to walk around the shop, you could pick up a bike. So this customer, John Yang, here's his customer number. He picked up a bike. It was the Touring 1000 blue. He bought some tires and tubes and a helmet and a jersey. And if you think about him going to the counter, those 4 items get scanned at the cash register. So here are the product codes. So when the products get scanned, those codes get recorded in the cash register. And then the cash register gives us a total for the transactions. It works out the tax and so on. So this is a typical retail sales example. And I like to use this database because we all go shopping and we can all associate with this shopping technique. But over here is the database that gets generated when that sale occurs. So notice here that these 5 items appear here in my sales table. So the sales table is a table of the transactional information that occurred in all of those scanning events within the Adventureworks business. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a sense of the data. I know not everyone is in the business of retail sales, but most people will understand that principle. So I'll just keep in mind that I'm going to be using that for the rest of my demo. Okay, so we're going to start off with data acquisition. I just need to make a little bit of space here and let me pull up my report here. So this is Power BI Desktop. Just let me shut that down. So here I am. I'm inside Power BI Desktop. You can download the software, as I said, and once it's downloaded, you know, you're pretty much free to go. Also notice that I have signed in up here. So you will need to create a free Power BI account if you're going to use the capabilities in particularly powerbi.com. But the first time you download Power BI Desktop, it will ask you to create an account. And so I just have a bit of a demo account here that I'm going to use. All right, so let me show you the data. So I'm going to build a reporting database for the Adventureworks company. And I've prepared this data in such a way that I can demonstrate the capabilities of Power BI. So in reality, I can do everything that I'm going to show you much easier using a different technique, but I'm trying to demonstrate the capability to you to give you a sense of what's possible. So here I have a folder, and you can see I have a number of CSV files, and those CSV files are transactions for each year. So one file for the year 2001, 2002, 2003. Let me show you what's inside one of those files. So it's a typical CSV file. It's got a header at the top, and then each row in this CSV file is a transaction. It tells me what product it was, when the transaction occurred, and so on. And this particular file is for 2001, it's about just over 1,000 rows. And the key point that I'm trying to demonstrate here is that there's actually 3 of these files. And so if I want to do my analysis, I need to combine the data from 3 separate files into one table, one sales table for analysis purposes. So I'm going to go ahead and load and combine these 3 files. So these watermarks, as Microsoft calls them, Microsoft's been trying to improve the product over time. And these watermarks are sort of a bit like a visual cue to you to tell you what you need to do next before you can start building out a report. And so the first step is to get some data. So I'm going to come up here and click Get Data. And as soon as I do this, I'm starting to use Power Query. So you won't see the word Power Query up here, but this is all Power Query. So I'm going to come up here and get data. Notice that there's this get data from a CSV file. Now I'm not going to use this because I would use this data connector if I was loading a single CSV file. But that's not what I'm doing in this case. And so I'm going to come down and click More. And this will give me a full list of all the data connectors that exist within inside Power BI. There's literally hundreds of them. And so these are all the standard connectors. You can import data from a PDF, from an Access database, and many other things. But one of the options is to import from a folder. And that's what I'm going to do. I want to load all the CSV files in my folder. So I'm going to click on Folder, connect to the folder. Now it's asking me where is the folder. I always prefer to come and copy the address from Windows Explorer. I just find that easier, just cut and paste that address and I'll click OK. And now Power Query is going to kick in and start to do its thing. So it looks in that folder and it says, okay, I found 3 files, they're CSVs, this is when they were created, modified, etc., etc. And I get some choices inside Power Query. So, and the choice I'm going to make is to combine these files. Now, it's important that I point out that this combine process only works if the files are a similar structure. You can't have completely different files with different columns and different types of data and expect to combine them together. So all of these files are of the same structure. They just have different numbers of rows and different transactional details. Now, I'm going to not load it immediately, but instead, I'm going to combine and transform the data. And so when I do that, Power Query now analyzes one of the files. Now, the way Power Query works is that it looks at the first file that it finds in the folder, which happens to be the 2001 file, and it looks at that file and tries to determine what type of data is in this file, and it tries to load that data for you. But notice how it says to me that the columns are called column 1, column 2, column 3, etc. And it's treating the actual headers as if it was text inside this table. So this is actually not quite correct. But the good thing is I can make a change here. Not in this window, but in the next window. So I'm going to accept the defaults. And when I do that, Power Query, now you can see the word Power Query. So Power Query Editor pops up on the top of the screen here. And now I have quite a lot of stuff happening over here. This is actually quite complex in its own right. So I'm definitely not going to go into this, just to say 2 things. That this query here, so these are all queries. This query here, the red one, is the set of instructions on how to process a single file. This query here is the set of instructions on how to combine all of the files in the one folder into one table. So those 2 things happen separately. There's quite a lot of other stuff here which is beyond the scope of this session. So if I come back to this sample file here, this is where Power Query didn't quite do what I wanted, because it's calling the columns column 1, column 2, but I want this first row of data to actually be the column names. And so just using the user interface, I'm going to come up here and I'm going to say use the first row as headers. And when I do that, I immediately get this change. So now my column headers are the headers that were in the first row of my CSV file. Now I can decide now, because I want to do a couple of things here, I can decide whether I do it here or whether I do it in the next step. I'm actually going to jump over here to the data column. To the data query. This is ultimately going to be my sales table, so I'm going to rename it just so I don't forget to do it later. And now I'm going to go through a process of choosing which columns do I load and which columns don't I load. Now there's various ways of doing this. I can go back and forth across the page, but I'm going to come up to the Home tab and go choose columns. And I get this nice user interface which allows me to choose which columns that I'm going to load. And so even though currently every column in the CSV is presented, I don't have to load them all. I can just load a subset of those columns. So I definitely need to know what product number, what was the date of the order, what was the customer number, and what was the store number. So that's what those 4 columns there are. I definitely need those, but I don't want all this information. I just want to know the value of the sales, the cost of the sales, and let's say the amount of tax. So I'm just going to choose to load those 7 columns only and click OK. And now you can see immediately that my table has been reduced. It's worth pointing out that all of these steps that are generated by Power Query are stored as a set of instructions on how to process the files. So I'm not destroying the data, I'm recording the instructions on how to convert the data. That's the key component of how Power Query works. Now, I'd like to point out now that notice that these columns all say ABC 1, 2, 3, and that's because Power Query is not really sure what type of data is in these columns. And so I'm going to select all of the top columns just by Control A, and I'm going to say transform, and I'm going to say automatically detect the data type. And when I do that, Power BI analyzes the data. In fact, Power Query analyzes the data in the top 1,000 rows. It just basically takes a sample of the data, looks at that data and proposes the type of the data. And you can see that these 3 are coming through as decimal. 1.2 means decimal. This one's coming through as integer, integer. This one's actually not quite right because this column has been typed as being date time. And for this database, I actually don't want the time. I just want the date. And so the automatic process works pretty well, but I actually don't want the time. So I'm just going to come up using the UI and say, just give me the date. And so now I've basically got that information that I need. Okay, so that's a starting view of loading that table. I'm going to come up here and close and apply. Power Query is going to take that set of instructions and it's going to process those instructions over the 3 files that I have in the folder, 2001, 2, and 3. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag the date and drag the sales amount onto the canvas, and without any more effort than that, Power BI has automatically produced a chart for me. It's loaded all the data from those files, and now I can very quickly and easily produce a column chart showing me the sales over a 3-year period. Now that alone is amazing, the fact that you can do that with such little effort. But the real power comes in the future when you get a new file that needs to be loaded as well. So I have another CSV file here for the next year, which happens to be 2004. I'm going to drop that file into the data folder. Now there are 4 files in the data folder, and now I can come up and just hit refresh. And when I click refresh, Power Query runs that script procedure again. This time it finds 4 files, and from there we're ready to go. Okay, so that's how you go ahead and load the data using a CSV. I've got a couple of other things because I want to show you the different ways that you can load data. So I'm now going to load some data from a SQL Server database. Many of you will have SQL Server within your organization. So I'm going to get some more data. So I'm going to say get data from SQL Server. Now I've actually got SQL Server installed on my laptop, and its name is just a dot or a period, and the database is called Adventureworks. So I'm going to connect to that database. See, I do have a choice of whether I import the data into Power BI or I do a query directly over the database. I'm going to import the data and I'll click OK. And now Power Query will make a connection to my SQL database. It looks inside that SQL database and says there are 5 tables that you can load into Power BI. So I've already loaded the sales table, so I'm not going to do that. I do want to load the information about my customers' products and my stores, which is called the territory. I'm not going to load the calendar table because I want to show you a third way that you can load data using Power Query in a moment. I will click transform because I do want to show you just another feature of Power Query. So one of the many features of Power Query is that if I choose not to load all of these columns, exactly as I showed you before, I can selectively unload some of those columns or choose not to load those columns. And so I might decide not to load the date of birth, the marital status and the gender, and I can just right click and remove those columns. And then even though they exist in the database, they're not going to get loaded into Power BI. Also, it's probably worth pointing out, particularly if you come from an IT background or a SQL background, if I right click on this column, there's this option to view a native query. And even though I've been using the Power Query user interface, what actually is happening, Power Query is writing a T-SQL statement that will get passed back to the SQL database. And so Power Query will only request the data that it needs. And so this is called query folding, and it's a standard feature, as long as you've got a database in the back end that can support query folding. One last transformation I'd like to show you. Here I have the name of each of my customers, so John Yang, Eugene Wang, and I'm going to produce another column. So I'm going to create a new column. I want their surname followed by their first initial. Now note that I don't have that data in this particular database, but I'm going to click here on the name and I'm going to add a new column to my table before I load it. And I'm going to use this column from examples tool that is part of Power BI. And the way this works is that instead of you having to know how to use the menus, instead of you having to know how to use the underlying language, which I'll show you in a moment, all you do is you pick a single row in the table and you just type into this new column over here exactly what you want to see. And so in here, I want to see Huang space, maybe comma J. All right, so I want last name, comma, space, followed by the first initial. Now, when I do that, Power Query says, please enter some more sample values. So this one is Huang, comma, E. And as soon as I hit that second example, Power Query is smart enough to work out what's going on. It's realized the pattern that I'm giving the surname followed by the first initial. And in fact, what it's done is it's written a line of code. So Power Query is supported under the hood by a fully functional programming language. It's called M. And Power Query has taken my example column, worked out how to write the M language, and has generated a new line of code. And so I'm going to call this my short name. And then I can just click OK. And now I've got my new column of values. And you can do this for as many columns as you need. The whole idea is to prepare the data before you load it into Power BI. There are some tasks that should be done in Power Query and other tasks that should be done as part of the modeling process. I also will just point out at this stage that there is this entire language. So if I come into the advanced editor, even though these steps are recorded here, this is the set of instructions that Power Query uses to transform the data, it is possible to jump to the advanced editor and see the underlying language which exists. This is the M code that I talked about before. And look, I understand the M language. It's not a mandatory requirement that you learn this language because the UI is very good. But if you want to get more advanced, you can certainly start to learn this language, and you'll start to be able to interact and do some more advanced things from that advanced editor. Okay, so the last data loading I'm going to show you is using that advanced M language. And here I've got a text file containing some code. This is the M language code. And this is a calendar table a list of dates. So it just contains a list of dates and years and things like that. And I created this calendar table using the user interface in Power Query, but I just store it in a text file on my PC. So that anytime I need a calendar table, I can just open that text file, copy the code, Control-C. Then I can come here and I can create a new query, which is a blank query, switch to that advanced editor and replace the standard code with that code that I'm storing in my text file. And this is the set of instructions to how to generate a calendar. So I click Done, and Power Query will process each of those steps. And as you see it, there I have a calendar table that I can use with this particular model. So I need to rename this. And you can do all sorts of things with these calendar tables. You can make them grow over time as your data grows and so on. All right, so I'm going to go File, Close and Apply. I'm finished with Power Query now. When I hit Close and Apply, Power Query will execute all 5 of those queries now, coming from different sources using different techniques. And despite them coming from different places, I now have 5 tables of data in my Power BI database. And if I jump over here to the data view, I can see each of those tables. This looks a lot like an Excel spreadsheet, but it's not an Excel spreadsheet because you can't change these data points. Once they're loaded, that's it. It's there for reporting purposes only. It's read only and it can't be changed. All right, so I'm going to just summarize and then just pause to see if there's any questions. So just to summarize, Power Query can import data from virtually any digital source that exists. If you can connect to it using one of the connectors, then you can load it into Power BI. It has a very easy to use UI-driven menu, which makes it easy for a layperson to use without having to learn the language. But there is a very powerful language under the hood, and you can learn that if you want to learn and be more powerful in doing that. So Power Query is certainly within reach of business users. So it's increasingly becoming available as part of Microsoft's other suite of data products, but it's certainly within use of any Excel user. You can transfer the skills between Power BI and Excel, and it's also very useful for other Excel tasks. It's not just for business intelligence. It can be used for all sorts of things that you would have used more traditional Excel for in the past. Okay, so we're moving on to the second topic, which I call data modeling. And it's a new term for most people when they start out. I mean, if you've seen me speak before, you've probably heard me talk about this analogy. Because data modeling, what does it mean? I mean, it's a little bit of a confusing term. And so I like to use this analogy. So let's talk about clay modeling for a moment. So clay is a raw material, right? It's a very useful raw material, but in its raw form, you can't do much with it. You can't have a cup of tea with raw clay. But if you give that raw material to a clay modeler, that person has the skills to mold and shape and prepare that raw material into something that's more usable, useful, reusable in the form of a teapot, or whatever else it is that you need to turn that raw material into in order to make it more useful. So that's a clay modeler, but a data modeler is exactly the same. You just have to swap out clay for data. So a data modeler, well, data is a raw material. I want you to think about data as just being a raw material. And in its raw form, it's not prepared for the purpose of reporting. It has a lot of potential and capability, but it's not ready for reporting in its raw form. If you want to use it for reporting, you have to give it to a data modeler, someone who knows how to prepare, shape, structure, enhance the raw data and turn it into something that's more useful. In this case, it would be a data modeler. So that's what data modeling is. It's taking the raw data that we've loaded and making it and preparing it for the purpose at hand. Now, I like to include all of these things in that process of data modeling. Some people might have slightly different views, but you've got to decide what gets loaded, what doesn't get loaded, 1 table, 2 tables, 10 tables. If you have more than 1 table, do you create relationships? What type of relationships? And I think perhaps most importantly is how do you write formulas to extract the business concepts from the raw data? And I'm going to show you this in an example in a moment. So you need to write formulas that explain the business logic so that you can enhance the raw data. And when you write those formulas, you give those formulas good business names and suitable formatting so that it's fit for purpose. So with that, I'm going to jump back and into a demo on data modeling. And so I'm just coming up here and I'll just close and apply. I've got this extra time column in my data. That doesn't really matter. You can jump back and forth between these logical stages as well. That's actually a very important part of the process. Okay, so I'm going to jump now to the model view. This is where data modeling starts. And when I do that, you can actually see that I've got like a helicopter view of these 5 tables of data that I've got. So I'm just going to position these here. So I've got, and there's a lot going on here, which once again, I don't have time to cover today. But when there's a sales transaction, that sales transaction belongs to an individual customer. You'll remember that from the receipt that I showed you up front. And I have a table containing all of my customers here. So this is the table of transactions for each customer. And this table contains the names of each customer and a whole lot of other information. And so part of the modeling process is creating relationships. And so I'm going to join the customer number to the customer number in my customers table. And I've now got a physical relationship between those 2 tables. Now, what I just did with that drag and drop is the equivalent of writing a VLOOKUP in Excel, if that makes sense to you. So if you in Excel have a transactional table and I drag and drop a column between those 2, that's the equivalent of doing a VLOOKUP in Excel. And I'm going to do the same. Here is the details of which products I sold. All the information about my products is in this table, so I'm going to create a relationship there. This is the sales, the store number, if you like. And this is the date of the transaction, which I'm going to join to my calendar table. Technically, this is called a star schema. There's a lot going on behind the hood, a lot of thought process about how to structure this data, which is out of scope for today. But once I've made those relationships, well, first of all, notice that my nice column chart showing sales by day is actually now showing me sales by order date. Once again, there's a lot behind that, but I'm just going to remove the order date. Currently, I've got the order date from my sales table. As part of my model, I've told Power BI to use the calendar table date instead. So I'm just going to bring that back, and now I've got my column chart there back the way it was before. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start to build some more visuals. Now, all of these over here are the standard visuals that are part of Power BI, and I'm going to add a matrix. So I'm going to click on a matrix, and I'm going to move my matrix up the top here. I'm not sure how much space I want. I've just got a placeholder at this point in time, and because I've built a data model, so this is my data model. Because I've built my data model, all of these tables work together. So I can say, I want to know sales. I want that in my matrix. So there's my total sales is 29 million. But I want to see what those total sales are based on the customer occupation. And so very quickly, I can see all the sales by customer occupation in my database. And those of you that have used pivot tables in Excel would be very familiar with this process. And this is one of the reasons I like to start with a matrix, at least start with a matrix, because it's very similar to a pivot table. So, and you can see that it just works. I haven't written any of the Dax language so far, just by dragging a column. In this case, it's a column of numbers. You can see the sigma is an indicator that it's a column of numbers. I've dragged that column, it's over here in the value section, and as a result, the numbers get summarized automatically. That's what Power BI does. Now, even though I can drag a column like this, my view is that this is not the best way to complete that task. And instead, I encourage you to learn about the Dax language, and this is what my book is all about, Data Analysis Expressions. It's the formula language of Power BI. Now, imagine you're using Excel and you don't know how to write a formula. If you could imagine a world where you're using Excel, but you have no clue how to write a formula. If you can't write the Dax language, then that's basically what's happening. And so instead, you should learn to the Dax formula language. So I'm going to write a formula. It's called a measure. And so I'm going to come over here onto the sales table. I'm going to do a new measure or a new formula. And this measure is, I'm going to be calling it total sales. And it's very similar to Excel. It's not the same, but it's similar. In some ways, it's a little bit deceptively similar. There's a lot to learn about the Dax language. But I now have to give Power BI the instructions on how to generate this business concept that I call total sales. And I need Power BI to sum or add up all the values in the sales amount column. So I just write a formula that says, add up all the values in the sales amount column. I'm immediately going to give it some formatting. So currency general, 0 decimal places. If I do it immediately, I remember to do it. I don't have to come back later on. And now that I've done that, I'm going to add this measure to my matrix, and it just works. And notice there's a few things that make this measure much better than this column. Firstly, I've got a good business name. Total sales is a good business name. Sales amount is not a good business name. I've also got the formatting that the business wants. And importantly, I've learned a little bit of Dax. And if you can incrementally learn a little bit of Dax, then you can use those skills to build over time. And you can see that I've got the same number. So I'm going to remove that column and just keep the total sales amount measure in my matrix. Now, I do want to write a couple more measures, but just to save a bit of time, I'm going to do a new measure. I'm just going to cut and paste these ones across. So here's my new measure. This time, I want to know what's the total cost. What was the total cost price value of the transactions? Same as before, I'm going to add up all the numbers in the total product cost column. I'm going to do my formatting. There is a way that you can do all this formatting at once, but I'm not going to go into that today. And I always recommend immediately put your measure into the visual so you can eyeball the numbers and make sure they look approximately correct. This is where your business knowledge comes in. So I can see my cost is less than my sales. Intuitively, that sounds pretty good. Now, both of these measures that I've written here can be achieved by dragging a column. So I've got this total product cost. I could drag the column, it will work. But what I'm about to do next, you cannot do by dragging the columns, because now I want to know how much profit or how much margin did I generate. And margin is the difference between the sell price and the cost price. And so I'm going to write a new measure. And I'm going to cut and paste it again. No, actually I won't, I'll type this one in. This one's going to be called total margin. And the formula is I need the total sales and I can subtract the total cost. And importantly, I can reuse these measures inside another measure. And so this is the principle of reusability. Once you build the concept of sales and cost, I can reuse those inside my other formulas. And when I do that, now I've got a third measure, total margin, and this is telling me how much profit that I've made in my transactions. Now, this is a very important point that I want to call out. This number, $12 million, or this concept of total margin, does not exist in the raw data. Say that differently. If I go over here to the sales table, here is the sales amount column, here is the product cost column, but I do not have a column telling me how much profit that I made. that concept does not exist in the raw data. It's only the formula that knows how to do that calculation for me. And it does the calculation on the fly, in memory, in real time, in sub-second response. And so this is the value of creating these measures, is you turn the business rules into a capability that doesn't exist inside your raw data. And this is the foundation of the concept of data modeling, enhancing your raw data so that it's better than what you had with just the raw data. All right, so one more, I want to work out what is the percentage margin that I made, just to show you that there is a tool which we call quick measures. So you can write a measure using what's called quick measures. So I'm going to right click here and say new quick measure, not new measure, new quick measure. And when I do this, I get a UI, and the UI is going to help me write a formula. So I want to do, to get the margin percentage, I have to do a division. So I'll go division, and I need to take the margin and divide by the total sales. So that's the way to calculate margin percent. And you need to, of course, understand the business logic to be able to write the formulas. Click OK. And that creates a new, this is a real measure, but when I drop it in here, there's a couple of things. Notice it says total margin divided by total sales. Well, that's not a very good name. Also notice that it automatically formatted it as $signs. Well, that's not very useful. So even though the quick measure does help you through the process of writing this formula, it doesn't do everything. So I'm going to give it a better name. I'm going to call it margin percent. And I'm also going to give it better formatting. And once I make those two changes, I've got my measure, which was written using quick measures. Obviously didn't pick up my formatting. Let me try that again. And there we have it. I might pump up a couple of decimal places because it is very similar across these products. All right, so still in the Dax language, let me show you something else. So I'm now going to perhaps just put another visual on this page. I'm sort of blurring data modeling now with visualization, but I'm sure you'll understand. But if I come to the territory table and I put a check mark in the territory, I'm now building a new visual. This new visual contains a map. So Power BI is smart enough to understand that the country column is a geographic concept. And when I added it to the report page, it drew a map for me. So that's very useful. And it's got a dot here for every country in which I operate. But what I'm going to do now, before I wrap up, is I'm going to grab the total sales measure and drop that on the map. And when I do that, my map redraws, and now the size of the bubble represents the total sales proportion for each country. All right, so I'm going to come back and do a couple more visualizations in a moment. I've sort of started to touch on visualization. It's important to point out, I guess, that maybe I'll come back here and do this, is that these 4 stages, acquisition, modeling, visualization, and sharing, that's the logical flow of data. But you do jump back and forward. You'll do some modeling, then you'll build some visuals, and you'll go back and do some more modeling, more visuals, and so on. So even though it's a linear flow of your data, you will definitely move back and forth as you build out your reporting capability. So data modeling is where you decide what to load, where does it go, 1 table, 2 tables, etc. It's where you take the raw data that was loaded into your database and start to write the formulas, which are called measures, to extract the business concepts from your raw data. So give it a good name, make sure that the business rules are reflected inside the calculations, and set it to the formatting that you need for your reporting purposes. So DAX is the name of the language, Data Analysis Expressions, and data modeling. Both of those things are well within the reach of anyone that is just competent in Excel. If you're competent in data use and competent in Excel, you can learn how to do these things. Most people need a little bit of help. And when you do learn these skills, it's fully transferable back to Excel using Powerpivot. It's also upstream convertible and transferable through to SQL Server Analysis Services Tabular. So if you're a professional Power BI developer in IT, you're going to learn the same techniques as I'm talking about here for self-service BI, indeed the same techniques for Powerpivot for Excel. I just want to go ahead and show you a little bit more on visualization, and then I'll go straight into sharing, and then we'll see if there's any final questions, and I'll try my best to wrap up at the top of the hour. So here's my workbook. I might just save it before I forget, and I'm going to just call this Adventureworks, and that'll help me find it when I publish it in a moment. I do want to do just a couple more visuals. Two of the really powerful features I love about Power BI. The first one is called Q&A. And so I'm going to double click on the blank report. And when I double click, now something's going funny here because when I did this, I was just doing a little bit of practice. Let me get rid of this one. I was doing a bit of practice before this session. I double clicked, it didn't work. Then the second time I ran through it, I double clicked, it did work. The third time I run through, I'm double clicking and it doesn't work. But not all is lost. Instead of double clicking, I'm going to click up here on this Q&A visual. It puts this little artificial intelligence report box on my canvas. And now I can ask a natural language query or a natural language request of my data, and Power BI will do its best to work out what it is that I want and how to answer that question. So I want to know, what are the total sales by color? All right, so I'm just going to say total sales by color. I'm going to use the Queen's English, color with a U. But notice how the little Q&A tool worked out that I meant the word color in American English, so that's fine. It's given me a, what is this? This is a bar chart, but I might say I don't want a bar chart, I want a column chart. So I could ask for a column chart, or I could ask for a tree map. I mean, I can basically use natural language to basically request the visual that I want. And this is another good reason why you should write measures and give them good business names, because notice that this blue underline is telling me that Power BI has recognized the concept of total sales from the measure that I generated. That would not happen if I didn't write a measure and I just kept the sales amount column. So another good reason to write a measure. So this is a bit unfortunate as a tree map because the colors are different. I'm just going to say, I'll just do a bar chart and I'll just leave it at that. So once you've got a visual that you like, I can leave it like this and someone else can come in and change it, or I can just convert it to a visual that I want to keep. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that. Jeff would be rolling over in his grave right now because Jeff's the visualization master and that looks horrible, but I don't have time to go into any more detail. Okay, last visualization technique. I'm going to add a line chart down the bottom of my page, and I'm going to put my calendar date on the axis and total sales on the values. And I'm doing a bit of sleight of hand here, but basically what I'm doing is I'm building a line chart that shows me the sales by month and year. And so you can see that this is the trend over time for my sales by month of year. And in fact, if I click on North America, you'll see that this line chart updates. If I click on, I think this is the UK, every other visual will cross filter as a result of you clicking on one of the data points. And I can multi-select. If I click on my sales by year and UK, this line chart is now showing me what happened in the UK in 2003. So this cross-filtering behavior is a big part of what Power BI does. Now, here's the killer feature that I want to show you. This is an artificial intelligence capability. See this big sales spike here? Something happened in December 2003, and I want to know what happened. And so I'm going to right-click on this data point and select Analyze, Explain the Increase. And when I do that, the artificial intelligence kicks in What it does is it looks at the data point in December, it looks at the previous data point in November, and it correlates the data and presents to you some potential causation as to what drove this change. Now, I do want to point out that this data I'm using is sample test data. It has no business value at all, and therefore what gets delivered here is not necessarily going to be of any value. But if you were to do this on your real business data, you would definitely see some value here. So, and so you can see here that Power BI has found a correlation based on the sales in November. Most of the sales, incremental sales, came from skilled manual customers, followed by management. So maybe there was some promotion that happened based on customer occupation, or maybe there was some work that was done based on different countries. You can see the United States had most of the sales increase, and so on. And if this is useful, you can add this visual to your report, and you can hang on to it and use it as part of your ongoing and build out of the report. So I really like that feature, and Microsoft is doing a lot of work at building this these tools to help you analyze the data so that you can focus more on understanding the data rather than having to try and find those insights yourself. Okay, just let me quickly check my notes. I think we're pretty much done there. So now one more thing I want to do is on this map, I'm going to just, these bubbles here represent the size, the total sales, 9 million in Australia. Canada had just nearly 2 million. What I'm also going to do is I'm going to color these bubbles based on the percentage margin by country. I want to know who are the higher margin countries, who are the lower margin countries. And I can do that too. There's a stack of formatting capability, but I can come here, click on my map. Instead of the data colors being blue, I'm going to use a formula to determine the color. I'm going to have a color scale based on that measure that I wrote before, which was called margin percent. I want the lowest value to be sort of a reddy color, the largest value to be a bluey color. And when I do that, you can see that just by glancing at the report, this is the highest margin country, this is the lowest margin country. I actually can't see what the margin is. And so I'm also going to add this margin as a tooltip. And now, if I'm trying to see what's happening in Australia, I can see that they're making 40.7, lowest margin. Canada is the highest margin at 42%. So lots and lots of capabilities. Haven't even started to touch the surface on this. All right, so wow, top of the hour. I'm nearly out of time. So I'm just very quickly going to tell you that I can publish this report to powerbi.com. I can then interact with that data, but there is one more thing I want to show you. And to do that, I need to jump to my other account. So this is a slightly different report that I've already produced, but it's the same Adventureworks database. You can see similar data that I've talked about. And there's this killer feature. Once you've published to powerbi.com, over here in this menu, there's this feature called Analyze in Excel. Once you've built your data model and you've published it into powerbi.com, you can click Analyze in Excel, open a brand new Excel workbook, and now we're back to traditional Excel world, where I just have to click a couple of warning messages, but now I've got a traditional Excel pivot table, and this will be very familiar to those of you that have had used pivot tables. I'm going to put the calendar year on the column. I'm going to put the customer occupation on the rows, and I'm going to bring the total sales into the values. All of these calculations have been done online with a direct connection through to the data model. And this workbook is very small. It's about 10 kilobytes in size, and it's now got a live connection through to powerbi.com. So as the online version of Power BI is updated, my Excel workbook will automatically be updated as well. And so you're in this new world where you can consume your data models directly in Excel without having to have a duplication of the data. So look, I did shoot a little bit over time there, so I apologize about that. But just to summarize, so with the visualization tools, everything cross filters everything else. So once you click on one of your visuals, it will summarize the rest of the visuals. I didn't touch on custom visuals, but there are a whole lot of custom visuals. If the standard visuals don't meet your needs, you share your reports using powerbi.com, and there's lots of other features like the Q&A that I showed you, the Analyze in Excel, and well, we ran out of time to have a look at the mobile apps, but you can download the app on your iPhone or Android device and just consume this as long as you have an internet connection. So yeah, so that's it. Let me ask if there's any more questions. Okay, thanks everyone. Thanks for joining.